Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 9, Section 5, The War Ends. So here we go. Roman numeral 1, Grant versus Lee. In the spring of 1864, Ulysses Grant had headed to Washington, D.C. to take command of the Army of the Potomac, or the Union troops that were facing General Lee. As a result of this left William Tecumseh Sherman in charge of Union troops in the West, and it really changes the course of the dynamics of the war. Grant is one of these generals that even if he might lose a battle, he's never going to give up the pursuit of the Confederate soldiers. So in letter B, after the first battle of Grant's campaign in the Wilderness, Grant attacked again near what is called Spotsylvania Courthouse, where two armies battled for at least 11 days. And in the course of this battle, it kind of goes off and on. Uh, it seems like every day the battle takes place, and then as the night falls, the troops move. And so you may hear about the Wilderness, you may hear about Spotsylvania Courthouse, you may hear about Cold Harbor. All of this is kind of pulled into this campaign. Letter C. Because the Confederate fortress at Petersburg was too strong, Grant put the city under siege. Uh, as Grant is pursuing Lee, one of the things that he does is he is trying to decide whether or not to force Grant to kind of put a stronghold around the city of Richmond. And not far from Richmond is the city of Petersburg. Grant had some of his officers design some plans to attack the Confederate troops that were stationed there, and things didn't quite turn out the way that they wanted. And as a result, this is going to become a very long and enduring battle, lasting roughly 9 months. And so, as we go from 1864 and the battle kind of continues into the beginnings of 1865, this becomes very tedious and kind of a thorn maybe in Grant's side, so to speak. Roman numeral 2, the Union advances. South of Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched his army from Chattanooga towards Atlanta. This is kind of in the beginnings of 1864, starting kind of in March. We have this campaign around the city of Atlanta, and it won't take long before Atlanta will fall. And as a result of that, Grant and Sherman are going to be on the offensive, being able to kind of wage the kind of war that maybe they had hoped for, maybe in the early days of the Civil War. Letter B. Admiral David Farragut did not capture the city of Mobile, Alabama, but he did seal off the bay. Mobile was one of those last bays or last ports that was in the hands of the Confederates. And by sealing off the bay, for the most part, the Union had now been able to cut off a lot of the supplies that were coming into the Confederacy via the Gulf of Mexico. And this is obviously a huge advantage to our Union troops. Letter C. When Sherman ordered all civilians to leave the city of Atlanta, he told the mayor that he was not only fighting hostile armies, but also hostile people. And as a result of this, one of the things that Sherman ordered was the burning of the city of Atlanta. And as you can see in the painting kind of below here, there's an American flag and some men on horses. The man that's kind of riding in front of the flag is actually William Tecumseh Sherman. A lot of Southerners, even to this day, do not like Sherman because of the type of warfare that he waged in the South. After winning in Atlanta, Sherman started moving his troops towards the sea, and he marches from Atlanta, which is kind of right here on the map, all the way down to Savannah. And on November 15th, Sherman began what is known as the March to the Sea. During this period of time, they really cut a swath of destruction. They burnt houses, they pillaged. Yes, you might see, yes, some of these Sherman neckties that were kind of strewn across the landscape. Sherman was able to give Abraham Lincoln a wonderful Christmas gift of the city of Savannah uh, for Christmas of 1864. After that, he moves his troops north towards uh, South Carolina, being able to take quite a bit of that territory by the early part of 1865. And as we're closing in towards spring of 1865, uh, Sherman is able to take his troops into the state of North Carolina. Had the war gone on, he probably would have met up with Grant's troops at some point in time. Roman numeral 3, the South surrenders. To oppose Lincoln in the 1864 presidential election, Democrats nominated a man who had kind of gotten some notoriety for leading the Army of the Potomac, a man named General George McClellan. McClellan was notoriously fired after the Battle of Antietam by Abraham Lincoln because he had as Lincoln called it, a case of the slows. And it's kind of interesting that the Democrats would run him against Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, kind of leading into this election year, he had a lot of bad press, wasn't polling very well, but he had some victories that were coming in, and that was all he needed. And he's going to win this election hands down. Letter B. The capture of Atlanta came just in time to revitalize support for President Lincoln, who won re-election with 55% of the popular vote. Also, in this kind of around surrounding this election, we have members of Congress, particularly a faction that would kind of be known as the Radical Republicans, that are going to push for an addition to our Constitution known as the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, for the most part, would actually take kind of what the Emancipation Proclamation set out to do to end slavery. But in this case, it would not apply just to the states that are in rebellion, but it would actually mean that all states would fall underneath this jurisdiction. And so this amendment is going to be added, and it bans slavery throughout the United States. Letter D. Lee's attempt to escape Grant's forces failed when General Phil Sheridan, who was a Union cavalry leader, blocked the road at a place known as Appomattox Courthouse. And as a result of that, Lee had to come to grips with the whole idea that the war was coming to a quick end. And this is at the beginning of April 1865. Grant is going to send messages across the line to the Confederate forces asking Lee if he's ready to surrender. And at some point in time, Lee responds saying he's ready to concede. So in letter E, Grant's generous terms of surrender guaranteed the United States would not have to prosecute Confederate soldiers for treason. And so on April 9th, 1865, this war is going to come to an end. When Grant and Lee meet at Appomattox Courthouse, which is not necessarily a courthouse, it's actually a town, and they met in a house, which is interesting because the people who had owned the home actually had moved there after the war began. Their actual home was destroyed at the Battle of Bull Run, or the First Battle of Manassas, one of the first major battles of the Civil War. And they thought they'd move off to an area that might be a little quieter, maybe less likely to have warfare in its backyard. And they ended up in Appomattox. And this is where the surrender actually takes place. So Grant also allowed the Confederate soldiers to take their horses home. The whole idea was that we wanted these soldiers to, on both sides, but including the Confederates, to wrap up this war and to go home in the spring of 1865 and be able to plant some crops and to get on to life as normal. And it's really kind of the vision of Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln, is kind of seeing that the war is more likely going to be in the favor of his troops and his plan, he issues a plan for kind of the reconstruction of the South. And it is a really lenient plan. Um, if you can take a look at the portrait that we have here of our generals sitting at this table at Appomattox, General Lee is dressed to kill. He's got his finest suit. He's got his red sash on his waist. He brings out his finest saber. His boots are clean and polished. But the truth is, when Ulysses Grant shows up, he is looking like he just came in from a long ride. Boots were dirty. His uniform was dirty. And matter of fact, the coat that you see pictured here is probably not authentic. Grant had a tendency not to wear anything that would designate his rank. And part of that was because he didn't want to be picked off by snipers. But at the same time, he wanted his soldiers to respect him as a leader, and not necessarily because of his rank. And so they meet together and they sign this document that ends this war. So in letter G, the North's victory in the Civil War strengthened the power of the federal government over the states. And in a way, it kind of changes the dynamic of what's going to happen in our country as we enter into uh, kind of the latter half of the 19th century and as we begin the birth of the 20th century. Some other little things I want to talk about is within 5 days after the surrender, we have tragedy that strikes the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by a guy named John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln had actually invited Ulysses Grant and his wife to attend Ford's Theater on the night of this assassination, and Grant and his wife respectfully declined. And so the Lincolns invited another couple. John Wilkes Booth was a very famous actor at the time. I think the best way to explain it is if you had to compare him maybe to a modern day actor, he probably would be kind of in the lines of maybe a Brad Pitt or a Tom Cruise. He was a household name in 1865. His brother was actually probably a little more famous than John Wilkes Booth, but John Wilkes Booth was known by most Americans. And, to think of a well known celebrity of that era carrying out this assassination, it's just kind of mind boggling. After Booth shoots the president, obviously he goes off into hiding. Um, it's going to be a matter of maybe about 14 days that he is going to be on the run, and eventually he's found down in Virginia and surrounded by Union troops. And what ends up happening is a Union soldier shoots and kills Booth, and so we never have an opportunity to put him on trial. But a lot of his conspirators are. Okay, to kind of wrap this up, there was also another tragedy that happened literally at the same moment as John Wilkes Booth's capture, and that is the sinking of a ship called the Sultana. This ship went down on April 27th, 1865, near the city of Memphis, Tennessee, and it marks that it was the worst maritime accident in U.S. history, meaning that more people died when the ship went down than in any other circumstances. The deal is this ship came from the north to pick up Union soldiers who had been freed from prisoner of war camps down in the deep south and had picked up a load of these Union soldiers in the city of New Orleans. The Sultana, just so you know, it was only designed to hold about 375 passengers, but because there was, a lot of folks that were wanting to get home, um, for some reason they overloaded the ship. And as you can see the photo here, this is one that is actually a photo that was taken just probably hours before the ship actually went down. There were over 2,000 passengers, almost 2,100 passengers on this ship. Um, and as it got closer to Memphis, which is further up the river, one of the boilers blew. And probably it's because of the load. The ship wasn't designed to carry this many people and the cargo that it had. And so over 1,100 people, almost 1,200 people died in this accident, making it obviously worse than um, a lot of other major catastrophes that have happened in American history. On the same note, when we're talking about legacies and such, our state of Nebraska didn't become a state until 1867. But as a result of the ending of the Civil War, there's a lot of ties to the Union that you might see in the forms of our counties and our communities within the state. So, for example, the city of Lincoln, named after Abraham Lincoln, and Seward County, and the city of Seward, named after William Seward, who was Lincoln's Secretary of State. You could talk about Ulysses, which is in Butler County, and further west there's Grant County, kind of a nod to Ulysses Grant. Uh, so it is amazing that this legacy of the Civil War is actually around us, just in the form of the names of some of our geographic features for where we live. Thank you very much.